you can see I'm getting a little angry because we tried to publish a rapid fat loss study, and we did this. We used 3 different methods of fat loss, and reviewers are like, why did you do this? Because you should.
So in today's episode of Fueling Greatness, I was joined by Professor Bill Campbell from the University of South Florida. And our entire conversation was about this topic known as rapid fat loss.
We want to get the body fat to a level, an optimal level, where power production is optimized, where recovery from training is optimized. There's no standard formula for that. That is trial and error.
We talk not just fat loss, and definitely not just weight loss, but the concept of losing body fat as fast as possible, through to more behavioral components and the all-important concept of adherence as being a key component of a successful rapid fat loss program.
I'm susceptible to this, and I have all the knowledge, all the experience. I know and I sympathize with everybody else.
And there's nothing worse than staring at that scale and you go, shit. So welcome to Fueling Greatness, Bill Campbell. Professor Bill, how are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. How are you?
Very good. Very good. We almost didn't have this chat because of my complete lack of competence at working out time zone differences. But I'm really grateful for the time that we have available today, Bill. We're not new to each other. We've met physically, it's many years ago now,
Italy,
number of
right?
times.
We were in
I think Italy was the last one. We were both at a conference, weren't we? Both speaking at a conference. And obviously at ISSN conferences periodically. Listen, let's just jump straight into this chat. You are a well-known researcher, particularly in the area of nutrition and body composition, and specifically fat loss. I'm going to have you tell us all about this now, although that is by no means your only area of specialization. One only has to look at your publications, and it's across the spectrum of sport and exercise nutrition. And of course, you've played a number of roles in leadership roles in this field. This conversation we're having today is going to get into the sort of the fat loss, rapid fat loss, aggressive dieting type conversation. But of course, my audience are primarily sort of maybe more of the athlete sort of, if they're going to have the moniker of something, it's going to be athlete. And by that, I'm thinking people who are not just thinking about aesthetics or their health, weight loss or fat loss because they want to look great in their swimming trunks. They do also want to be functional. But either which way, everyone is really interested in this topic of fat loss, rapid fat loss, how to achieve a certain physique. And even though I've worked with a lot of elite athletes over the years, particularly like professional soccer players, for example, even off season, they're particularly keen on achieving a certain look because they're going to go on summer holiday. Of course, their egos demand that from them. But it doesn't matter who you talk to. Everyone's interested in this idea of fat loss, weight loss, and so on. So why don't you just give us a bit of a background about yourself, Bill, and how you came to specifically work in this unique area?
Yeah, so my career started off not in academia, not in research. I was actually in sales. I used to sell bug killer and weed killer. And
I didn't know this. How did I not know this?
Well, I don't talk about it a whole lot because it has nothing to do with...
You're a killer, Bill.
I was a killer, and I didn't like being a killer. At least I didn't wake up in the morning with a lot of energy to kill weeds and to kill bugs.
Sure.
But I did love exercising, especially lifting weights. And I really just loved the science of supplementation. There was something about the idea that I could take a supplement and it could accelerate my gains in the weight room or on the track. And at the time, I'm old enough now when I remember when creatine was introduced to the market. So that was really I'm like, wow, this is incredible. Like, this is accelerating strength gains and building muscle. So I've always had a love of the science. But anyway, I had to go back to school. I had all business classes. So I basically started over in my late 20s. Had to go back to school, take anatomy and physiology, chemistry, biochemistry, biology, like all of these things to prepare me for what I thought might have been a career in sports nutrition. But the further along I got in my master's degree, so I have a master's in exercise physiology, then I went into a doctoral program and I started to appreciate, I think I will make the biggest impact on this field as a researcher and not as a business person, not as a consultant or working for a sports supplement company. And I know there has been never a doubt. I love the research process. I love mentoring students, learning from my students. And I'm a very cynical person. I don't believe anything. So using that type of mind, a very cynical mind, is perfect to be a scientist because you're supposed to question everything. So that's kind of my story. And then just real quick, my career started really initially in sports nutrition. A lot of my research was in nutrition and supplements to improve exercise and sport performance. And then over the last few years, as you said, I've really focused on fat loss. And my lab, I would say, is one of the leading labs which is very important for athletes. We try to take off as much fat off of the human body as possible while maintaining lean mass in the process. Because there's a lot of harm that can be done when you lose lean mass in a dieting process. Now, that doesn't mean that you're ruined forever, but if you're an athlete and you don't do things correctly, at a minimum, you're just slowing down your ability to improve over time, at a minimum, if not having to come back from decrements in performance and trying to build up muscle that you may have spent years trying to build.
Do you know what's interesting about this whole topic? This is 2024. This is May 2024, and we're talking about weight loss, fat loss. There isn't actually that much knowledge out there. Now, there's a lot of people who think they know a lot about this stuff, right? And you talk about being skeptical, and I love a quote which maybe didn't originate from the late, great Professor Kevin Tipton, but he would say it all the time whenever I was talking to him about being skeptical but open-minded, but not so open-minded your head falls off, right? Which is it's that difficult area to traverse when you're a scientist, but everyone eats, everyone has an idea about how to lose weight, gain weight, but not necessarily lose body fat. Has this been a driver for your research to go down this path where, frankly, there is very little actual research and evidence? A gap, if you like, a gap in the area?
So, yeah, my career, my graduate school work was very mechanistic in the realm of muscle hypertrophy or muscle physiology. So I took muscle biopsies and we looked at like the AKT-mTOR pathway, the MAP kinase pathways. So I was very much into the mechanisms. And then when I got out and started my own lab, I decided want to be in research, but I can make the biggest impact if I'm serving the practitioners. So the coaches, the strength and conditioning coaches, fitness professionals. And I didn't think that my mechanistic work would serve them the best. Now, mechanistic work it's very important. It's what drives the scientists to do the work that then people like me, applied scientists, can take to then serve the practitioner. So that's kind of been my approach. I like to think that I'm answering the questions that the practitioners and professionals working with the athletes, working with weight loss clients, what questions do they have? What are they struggling with? Then I take those questions into the lab and verify maybe what they've been doing for years, but now actually putting it under a scientific standard and say, hey, what you've been doing, we have evidence that it actually is better than X, Y, or Z. Or in many cases, it may not be better, but you're causing no harm. So I have embraced the applied aspects of fat loss, not necessarily the mechanism. So I haven't done my part as a scientist in answering a lot of these unknowns, but rather verifying what we think we know.
So we're using terms like weight loss, weight gain, even fat loss, dieting, diets in general, aggressive dieting. Maybe I think it'd be useful to define a few of these things here, because these words are used very interchangeably, but not necessarily accurately, right?
Yeah, so weight loss is the term that everybody uses. And if you're a student of mine, we don't use that word because weight as a number on a scale does not tell you how successful you've been with retaining, or in some cases, building lean tissue. Now, if you let me just speak for athletes. Athletes don't have to build muscle. What matters for an athlete is their ability to perform. In some situations, building muscle is good, but it's really the functionality of the muscle that an athlete has is what's going to give them success on the field. So it's very important as we talk about these definitions of fat versus weight. We also have to clearly define, are we talking about an athlete who has to perform on the field, or are we talking about somebody who just wants to lose some body fat? That's a very important distinction because performance and physique are two different populations in my mind. And in terms of whenever I say weight loss, if I'm going to use that term, what I mean is fat loss. Because fat loss, typically, if we have excess fat on an athlete's body, that is essentially dead weight. Now, we also have the issue, some athletes can be too lean. They have fat levels that are too low and they're not able to perform optimally. So something I'm sure you do, because I've known you for a long time. I remember even, I think we talked, like you're constantly assessing your athletes. And then you get to the point where, hey, when you're around this body composition, when you're carrying this much muscle and this much body fat, this is where you seem to have the most power production. This is where you're recovering the best. So I love the idea of fat loss, but not the mindset that we have to eliminate all fat on an athlete's body. We want to get the body fat to a level, an optimal level, where power production is optimized, where recovery from training is optimized. And that really, we don't know. There's no standard formula for that. That is trial and error and the help of a professional coach that can guide the athlete in those things. Something else I remember, and I love this. You and I don't know if you're still doing this, but you used to take 3 different body compositions or body fat measurements. It's amazing how many scientists don't appreciate that and don't even understand why you would do that. You can see I'm getting a little angry because we tried to publish a rapid fat loss study. And we did this. We used 3 different methods of fat loss, and reviewers are like, why did you do this? And it's like, because you should. But anyway, that's a rabbit trail.
Yeah, well, I devoted an entire chapter in my my doctorate on this concept of, say, triangulation of data for practice. You can't, no one method is particularly reliable in a practical setting, because there's just so many factors that influence this data that you're getting. But I don't think the general public appreciate this, or actually a lot of researchers, as you're inferring there, I don't think appreciate this.
Sadly.
But also human beings are, we're these organisms that are highly influenced by what's between these 2 ears and behind these eyes. And the brain can be a hell of an issue. If you do not see a number change on that scale, they really don't care about what a percentage is, because they don't even know what that means. What is a percentage body fat? Percentage of what anyway? And you start telling them bits of data, and you can really lose your client, your athlete, and the psychological impact of a number going up is profound. Maybe we should just quickly talk about that, because this is one of my favorite areas, is when we talk about body composition and so on. I think people seem to think we actually are accurately assessing, measuring body fat, muscle mass, etc. on a person. Particularly when we stand on scales in our bathroom, that can be taken as pretty factual information. But also, I guess it's this idea of quantity versus quality, isn't it? What are your thoughts on that?
When I step on a scale for myself, just to elaborate on something that a lot of people do, I step on that scale 2 or 3 times and take an average. Just for the reasons that we're talking about now. There is no one method and no one device that is 100% accurate. So the more trials you do, the more assessments you do, on average, you're getting to a true value. Now, Practically speaking, when I'm working with an athlete, or just to say a weight loss client, or professionals that work with these people, in terms of quality versus quantity, I like to tell people, listen, we can't put, if you're an athlete, I'm a fat loss researcher, so I love data. I love body fat numbers. But as an athlete, I do not want them getting hung up on a number. This is data for your coach to use in their overall planning. And this is just one piece of the data that they're going to use to prescribe the best program for you. But while we're getting this data, it's very important that you use the same device over time. You'd be amazed how many people switch devices and they think that the numbers are exactly relevant to each other. So use the same device, and please do it first thing in the morning before you've eaten, before you've exercised. So we want to standardize how the athlete is getting the data. And if it's skin folds, I love skin folds, make sure it's the same technician. If it's one of these handheld ultrasounds, make sure it's the same person doing this. So there's a big emphasis on the quality of the measures. If we're going to get this data, let's make sure that the data we're getting is as true to the actual value of your body composition as possible. So same device, same technician at the same time of day. So that there's the first message if I'm working with individual athletes that I want them to appreciate. And we care about your performance. That's why you're going to get a contract. That's why you're going to get a scholarship, not in what this number says.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a can of worms, Bill, because these devices appear to be accurate. Now, I know that there's some issues there. Even if we're going to talk about things like DEXA, assessments, that technology varies from brand to brand, from software to software, version to version, and obviously technician to technician, time of day. There are so many variables. But at the end of the day, we still need to arrive at an understanding as to where we are from a baseline perspective. But, obviously the most important thing is being able to track these changes in our body composition, because before we even have this conversation about rapid fat loss, it's really difficult even to quantify how much fat an individual actually has. So when we're talking about rapid fat loss, how do we even really know what's going on? And I guess that's when we go from an acute perspective to maybe a more chronic, longer term perspective. What do you think?
Yeah, so that's when as soon as the word rapid fat loss is entered into the conversation or is entered into the equation, the first thing that enters my mind is, what is the length of this? And that is coming from a methodological component as a researcher, and also from a harm perspective, because a rapid fat loss strategy, what we see in the research is the length of these approaches is what dictates the harm for the athlete in terms of causing negative physiological consequences. And an area that I've actually changed my mind on quite robustly in the last couple of years is, previously I would say that there's never a place for rapid fat loss. We just don't use them. The research is clear. There's harms. There's body fat overshoot. We can get into that. And then more recently, after doing a study in my own lab and then reading some other research, I've now have the opinion, and we're actually about to follow up with another study on this. I now have the opinion that as long as the aggressive prescription for fat loss is very short-term in nature, research from my own lab and research from other labs are reporting that you can essentially target all fat and maintain muscle. But this is all contingent on the length of the dietary intervention. It has to be short. And I mean days and potentially weeks, 14 days or less. And again, we can get into all of that. But it's one of those areas in my career where I used to think one thing, and I've really changed my mind. And there's been nobody that's been more outspoken than me about not being in a rush to lose body fat. And that is still the message that I advocate for. The only thing I'm saying is, if you want to start a diet more aggressively, but your overall weight or your overall fat loss goals still need to be measured over time. We're never in a hurry, but that doesn't mean we can't have periods of fat loss sprinting, so to speak.
That's a phrase I've not heard before, Bill. Fat loss sprinting. I love it. That's a good one.
Yeah, and let me just say, I'm trying to work on how I'm articulating this, because again, in the wrong hands, this does a lot of damage, this crash dieting or this aggressive dieting. So to me, it's fat loss sprinting, high intensity interval dieting. I will settle on one of these terms to describe my hypothesis. So you're kind of hearing it, kind of throwing it out and live, so to speak. But that also implies, hey, there's a strategy behind this. And it kind of plays on this high intensity interval or sprint interval training that was so popular, a decade ago for conditioning.
No, I like that, Bill, because I think it's important that we provide an identity to this that is, one that people can actually understand, I guess more accurately, more realistically for what it actually is, because you use phrases like, crash dieting, rapid fat loss, and people, they do not appreciate, what's involved in the body physically getting rid of body fat. That physiological, biochemical process is a pretty complex process in itself. And maybe that's where we should start, because look, it's extremely understandable that an individual is going to stand on the scales and they're going to go, listen, I'm 220 pounds, let's say. And they can see lots of wobbly bits and they go, do you know what? I need to lose 30 pounds. And they will embark on a journey of crash dieting or whatever. And one of the first things that they're going to be confronted with is just how damn hard this process is, because after 1 week, they still need to lose 30 pounds, probably, because there's all sorts of short, medium, and long-term adaptations to the process of dieting, depending on how you go about the dieting. And this is stuff that you're going to talk about soon. The amount of an energy deficit matters, the acuteness of the energy deficit. What do you pair that with? Things like protein intake, resistance training, obviously, all sorts of bits and bobs. But nonetheless, people are impatient. And impatience is a problem because that is pretty much what's going to result in you giving up on your diet. Or what I see very commonly is not necessarily giving up on the concept of I need to lose weight. They just keep changing approaches and strategies, which in itself, of course, is an issue. And we should approach some of those topics if we have enough time. Can we just dial this back, though? Because we're talking about fat loss. From the audience can handle a nice technical chat about this, Bill. But, it isn't simply just a case of calories in, calories out. Can you just give us a slightly better overview? And I realize we're limited for time here, but just an idea of what's involved and the nuances that are involved.
Yeah, so when we use the term fat loss, what we mean is we're trying to take fat that's currently stored in our body, in adipose tissue or fat cells, and we're trying to get that into the atmosphere, essentially. So what do I mean by that? So our adipose tissues store triglycerides, which is a bunch of carbon and hydrogen bonds. And these carbon-hydrogen bonds, they store energy. And when we have excess energy in the body, it stores it as body fat. So essentially what we're doing, think of a balloon. We're trying to shrink the size of a balloon. And the lesson there is we're trying to shrink the size of our fat cells. So we don't really eliminate fat cells, we reduce the size of them. And this is a two-step process. First of all, we have to liberate the fat that's in our fat cells. So these carbon and hydrogens. So this is conveniently stored in a triglyceride. And I always use this as an example. You put up this. We have a backbone, and we have 1, 2, 3 fatty acids that's currently in my fat cells, and I don't want them there. I want to breathe out all of this energy that's stored here so that my fat cells get smaller. So there's 2 steps to this. The first one is we have to get this triglyceride out of the fat cell so that it has the capability to be burned for energy. So this first step is called lipolysis. And lipolysis is basically taking off 1, taking off 2, and then taking off the 3 fatty acids from this glycerol backbone. And now when we've done this, these fatty acids make their way to the blood, and now they're floating in the blood, and they're waiting to be burned for energy. And the best way to do this, the way that you guarantee that you will burn these fatty acids for energy, because if you don't burn them for energy, they'll turn right back around, and the term is called reesterification. They'll turn right back around and just resynthesize into your fat cell into another and new triglyceride. So we call that a futile cycle. But if we're in a caloric deficit, or if we are physically active, both of those, physical activity is the best fat loss stimulus on the planet. Now, it doesn't mean it's easier than dieting, but a caloric deficit and physical activity kind of like pull these fatty acids into the active tissues, and I always use muscle as our example, where now that they're liberated, they can be burned or technically oxidized for energy. And essentially what that is, if you want to get technical, it's beta oxidation is the term in muscle, and this occurs in the mitochondria, where if we need energy, what we will do is we have these fatty acids, these carbon and hydrogen bonds, and they're about 18 carbon lengths long. They'll go into the mitochondria, and it will chop them up. And as in the process of chopping them up and taking off electrons and transferring them to the electron transport chain, all of these things are essentially capturing the energy that was stored in these bonds that can now be used to fuel the body's systems in a caloric deficit or to fuel our exercise sessions. So whether we're on the football field or in the weight room, wherever we're exercising, we now have used that energy to fuel either physiological functions, or to fuel the exercise and training session. And then ultimately, these carbons that we used to extract this energy, we breathe off as carbon dioxide. And what was once in our fat cells is now in the environment. So there's kind of a general overview of the physiology of fat loss.
I think there's something you said there, which I think most people don't even know, is the fact that you do breathe off. When you lose weight, you're actually breathing it off. You're not peeing it off, forgive the phrase, you're not pooing it off, you're breathing it off.
Yeah.
Which is, I remember telling students about that, and they're like, wow, that is pretty, it is pretty awesome. But I think just to hang on this topic, because it's very easy to look at this from a static perspective, as if we're looking at a diagram in a textbook. With some arrows and bits and bobs. It's the dynamic process of this that I find particularly interesting. And it's not just, something that happens just within a second or a minute. There's sort of ebbs and flows of this turnover of fat storage, fat liberation, and so on. And of course, the big joke, of course, is, you see somebody doing their fat burning treadmill session, but they're also drinking their sugary sports drink at the same time. And what they don't appreciate is that whatever they're burning off, they're probably consuming even more. Or you've got these compensatory mechanisms later in the day where you might have done all this fat burning activity, but then things like fidgeting, etc., tends to slow down for a period of time. Would you maybe look at it from that holistic perspective?
Yeah, so that kind of gets into something known as the energy compensation model. And this really makes sense just for everybody. So here's what I ask my students. If I put you on a 500 calorie diet today, do you think you'll lose weight? And the answer is yes. And I say, do you think you'll lose as much weight 6 months from now by, keeping your 500 calorie deficit? And the answer is always no. All right, so let me change the question. If I have you go on a treadmill for an hour today, and you didn't change anything about your food intake, Do you think you'll lose weight in the next few weeks? The answer is yes. And I agree. If you are burning 750 calories from an hour of treadmill running, you will lose body weight. You'll lose most of it will be body fat. And then I ask, if I have you run for that same hour, the same intensity, you're eating the same number of calories, getting the same amount of sleep, in 6 months, do you think you're going to be losing the same amount of weight that you lost in the first few weeks? And the answer is no. So we all appreciate something is happening in our bodies that doesn't allow it to just keep losing and losing and losing weight. And according to this theory known as the energy compensation model, and this is particularly around exercise, or at least my application is around exercise to weight loss. As we begin to increase our physical activity, our cardiovascular exercise, the body begins to adapt to that over time. So that when we used to burn 750 calories of exercise for an hour of treadmill, after a while, the body's not burning, it might only be burning 550 calories after a period of time. So the body will adjust to this, what used to be a new stimulus is no longer a new stimulus. And there was actually a study on this. So Herman Ponzer obviously was the researcher that really popularized this to a lot of the what I call the masses. He has a book called Burn.
In his book, Burn, wasn't it? Yeah,
Yes.
I read that. Yeah, it was interesting.
And then, so I read that, and this really helps formulate, strategies to help athletes lose weight so that we can avoid this compensation. So we can talk about things like diet breaks and refeeds and periodized dieting, essentially. But there was a mathematical modeling study that looked into this, and what they estimated was about a 72% efficiency of energy compensation. So let me say what that means. If you over time are burning 100 calories per day, or no, if you're burning 100 calories per day on the treadmill, what actually your body will then adjust over the next 23 hours, and it will slow down some of the fidgeting, as you said, or the non-exercise energy expenditure. Some people call it NEAT. So your body adjusts, according to their mathematical modeling, about 28%. So yes, the treadmill and my fancy gadgets told me I burned 100 calories, and that's true. But what those fancy gadgets don't tell you is the rest of the day, your body has slowed down some of its normal metabolic activity, such that you really, at the end of the 24-hour period, you burned about 72 excess calories. So again, you lose about 28% efficiency from this energy compensation model. And again, we have to admit that's a mathematical modeling study, but just look at all of the research where subjects have been confined so that there is not a lack of adherence. We see similar outcomes in that the rate of fat loss over time gets less and less. So again, we see this in the research. We admit that we appreciate it happens conceptually. And this mathematical modeling study did a great job of giving us some quantitative estimates.
Yeah, and I mean, there's if we delve in the literature, there's some very interesting metabolic ward studies that you're sort of referring to, I think, and there's some very interesting research done in metabolic chambers as opposed to just on a basic RMR, estimator, all the way down to somebody that's got MyFitnessPal or whatever, and they're just using some very basic metric to determine what their needs are. But either which way, it's a bit like this conversation about how do we actually determine how much body fat somebody's got or muscle mass? How do you even know how much you're eating? Because I know we can with some degree of accuracy, we got an idea of how many calories we're able to get through in a workout. But I mean, the rest of it is complicated stuff, isn't it? And we're trying to be precise because if in a minute we'll talk about things like energy deficits and how do you determine an appropriate energy deficit, and we're going to use reasonably small numbers, 300, 400, 500 calories maybe. That's not much if you think about it. This precision issue, as a scientist, obviously, Bill, you'll appreciate precision, but as a pragmatist also, there's inherent problems with that, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's why you'll hear scientists use the word estimate. We are estimating your body composition. We don't know. We can use a DEXA, bod pod, skin folds. We're not measuring it. We're estimating it. If you want to measure it, you sacrifice the subject, and you either weigh, you cut off the fat and you weigh it. So that's how you measure it. So we at best are measuring. I always laugh. An athlete will tell me, "Oh man, I don't have a DEX." And again, I like DEXAs. No problem with DEXAs. I love DEXAs. But they'll say, "Man, I don't have a DEXA." And I'm like, "Well, do you know what a DEXA measures?" They're like, "Yeah, it's the best thing for measuring fat." I'm like, "But do you know what it measures?" And they're like, "Fat." I'm like, "No, it measures pixels on a screen. Your DEXA gives a screen 3 different colored pixels based on the density of your tissue, and it's estimating your fat based on literally pixels on a screen." And then I said, "You know what a skin fold is measuring?" "Oh, that's the least technical." I'm like, "But it's measuring actual subcutaneous fat and skin." But skin folds are literally measuring or estimating, and actually they are measuring the thickness of a bifold of actual subcutaneous fat, whereas DEXAs, bod pods, MRI, and again, I love them all. I'm not discriminatory, but I always say this to athletes who think there's something better. What we have is what we have, and I need you to embrace that. And then earlier we said, just make sure that we do the consistency so that we get a valid number. So I don't remember what your original question was about this.
Oh no, well I'll come back. No, there's I'll just throw in there. There's a great paper by it's out of Professor Graham Close's group. I think Andy Casper might have been I think he's now Dr. Andy Casper might be the lead author. It's something along the lines of comeback skin folds, all is forgiven. And it's on this basis that very concept is actually, hang on, the skin fold assessment is actually really, really quite useful. The problem is lots of people don't know how to do skin fold testing. They use the wrong equipment. They don't necessarily know how to measure sites. We do have a way of standardizing that through Isaac methodology, which I've trained in, for example. But even then, it's tricky. But I think we are talking about something, aren't we, that there's a highly visual component, though, to this. You can differentiate somebody who's got a six-pack from somebody who's got a gut. So there is a sort of a visual element there, but things still get blurred, don't they? Because if you've got a gut and you want to get to a six-pack, bringing us now back to, how long it actually takes to get from having a gut to a six-pack, is quite a long period of time, and the sensitivity of our visual capacity, which will be inherently messed up by our negative views of ourselves, when we think, "Oh God, I'm still fat or overweight or whatever." For the individual, when we're talking about determining fat loss, quality fat loss, just to keep this more practical, what is your sort of go-to method based in, presumably you're doing research studies where your participants aren't necessarily coming into the lab all the time? Is there a degree of self-reported or remote observation going on? How are you doing those studies?
So up until recently, we've had our studies in my lab where our subjects would actually have to be assessed in our lab. And we would use skin folds and A-mode ultrasound. So A mode is inferior to B mode. So B mode is more sensitive. But A mode, if you're just measuring fat thickness, it's great. It's a great device. I have used DEXAs in our case studies. Now we have a bod pod. And again, back to your triangulation theory, we have an in-body ultrasound bod pod. So I'm getting multiple measures. So that's what we do. So we've just had a study approved about 2 weeks ago for the first time. It's a truly virtual study. And unfortunately, and I actually have one of Dr. Ponzer's postdocs helping with this study, it has limited us to have body weights as our primary endpoint for morphology, I guess. I can't even say body composition when it's body weight. So we are measuring. This is a reverse dieting study. Now, within this, to help, we are asking the subjects across the world, because you can be anywhere in the world to do this study. It's a reverse dieting study. And essentially what we're asking is, what do you do when the diet is over? And we're trying to figure out the best strategies to maintain previous fat loss. So what we've done here to try to introduce some element of precision with fat tissue is allow subjects that have access to a research grade device that they can do that. Now, that might be bod pod for some. It may be skin folds for another, as long as the technician is trained. It may be a DEXA for others. So that will be a subsample of our overall subject population who have access to research grade body composition devices. So that's how we have, and I'll be honest, the whole reason why I've never done a virtual study is exactly because of this conversation. You can't trust the home scales that I would love to trust. They're so easy. And I don't want people to have to travel to Tampa, Florida to get their body composition assessed. So what we've done for the first time is make it body weight based, and then a subsample of body composition assessments for those that have access and the means to get them.
So that's an important bit of the conversation, because look, realistically, people aren't going to have access to DEXAs and so on. And we can talk about the issues with DEXAs and so on. But the reality is people are weighing themselves, right? And they're looking at themselves in the mirror. And that information informs their decision-making, their emotional responses to that information. I do it myself. I've always had ups and downs with my weight, and there's nothing worse than staring at that scale and you go, shit, I've been working my ass off for a week and I haven't lost any weight, or I've gained weight. And of course, there's a lot of things at play there, of course. And we don't have time to, delve too deeply in this area. And by that, I mean things like the glycogen content of muscle and the associated water content, which weighs something. The contents of the gut, maybe for females, the menstrual cycle might have an impact on their weight as well over the course of the month. Time of day. I mean, there's so many different factors that can influence your weight, and your variation from day to day can be what, Bill? What are your observations on that?
So I would like to say as a percentage, because then that would cover large and smaller bodied people. But it's 1 to 3 pounds is what we would see from day to day, or 1 to 1.25 kgs from day to day. And a lot of that.
Which a liter of water, folks, is 2.2 pounds. So a liter of water, that's quite a lot.
Yes. Now, that's not always, but we're talking about what can happen. And practically, as I do my weight loss studies, or I'm working with athletes, as long as they're not disordered eating concerns, I have them weigh themselves daily, and everything is based on a weekly body weight average as we're getting this. And then again, about every month, then we try to do a body composition assessment. And that, then again, it's just more data. Then we start to say, okay, where do we need to adjust? Do we need to go a little harder in this direction? Do we need to pull back a little bit? So it's I don't love putting too much of an emphasis on body weight for people who are active, because there's so many variables. You could be gaining lean mass and losing body fat, and the scale doesn't move, but yet you have drastic changes in your actual physical body. And again, usually that's noticeable in the mirror. But there's a large education, and I'm a over communicator when it comes to this stuff. We will not get excited on any day based on if that scale says we lost weight. We don't get excited, nor will we get disappointed or depressed if the scale says we gained weight. We have natural fluctuations, like you said, females with the menstrual cycle. How much sodium did we have the day prior? How much water did we drink? Different sodium content of foods. But when you take a weekly average, that gets rid of so much noise, and you can get a much truer picture of what's happening. And it helps people just to chill out.
Absolutely. And I wish we could spend more time on that particular angle of the conversation, but I've got lots of experts getting into this stuff. In fact, the first episode with Alan Aragon, we did discuss a lot of these things. Let's just, because I'm aware that we don't have a whole lot of time here. I've been talking about, the concept of fat balance, illustrating that, fat burning does not necessarily equal fat loss. You've illustrated that in detail, but we are trying to talk about rapid fat loss. How much fat can you lose over a short period of time? I mean, what actually is rapid fat loss in the real world? What's that likely to look like? And then we absolutely must get on to how we actually achieve that in the first place.
So there was a study in males with obesity that used an extreme caloric deficit with what I would call extreme physical activity. And they had their subjects lose about a pound of fat per day, or what is that, about 0.45 kgs per day, over 4 days. So that's as rapid as I've ever seen it. Now, what they had these males do was consume, I think it was about 1.6 grams of calorie, or 1.6, or maybe it was 3.2. I'll say this, around 300 calories per day on average for these men with obesity for 4 consecutive days. So a couple hundred calories. And also had them walk 8 hours per day for 4 consecutive days and do 45 minutes of arm ergometry exercise for these 4 days. So that has been the most extreme or rapid fat loss study that I have ever read. And that study, kind of in conjunction with my own research in resistance trained people, kind of is what shifted my my thinking on this. The fascinating thing with this study of, if we want to say a pound a day, because that's a nice, easy number for everybody to appreciate. But again, these were males with obesity, so it's easier for them to lose a pound of fat a day than it is for a normal-sized female. But the one thing that really caught my attention was they after this 4 days of this extreme dieting and physical activity, they had the subjects kind of refeed for 3 days, and then they had them come back in a month. And typically what I would have expected was in a month they would have gained all that body fat back, but they didn't. They maintained almost all of their body fat loss 30 days later, and then they had them come back 12 months later after this this extreme fat loss phase. And once again, we noticed that they didn't maintain all of their fat loss, but like 70% of it a year later. And all of the clinical health markers were improved at 30 days. Most of them were still improved at a year. So there's a situation where being very precise and aggressive for a very short time really caused all good and no harm in these subjects. And again, that's the previous research that I had read used longer aggressive periods, and that is where the harm was. So this has guided my I guess you call it my philosophy on this. Aggressiveness can be done as long as it's very short term. That would be the extreme. What we did in my lab, we had a 14-day rapid fat loss, and I think you can even go out to 28 days. So you kind of have these, everything's less than a month, but you have different strategies of whether it wants to be 4 days, 14 days, or 28 days. They all have different strategies or different variables. Like as an example, just the low-hanging fruit here is I would do no resistance training during these 4 days. But if I'm having somebody be aggressive for 28, there will be even 14 days. There will be a resistance training stimulus. So, and then you have to adjust the level of the deficit the longer you're going to go. So I just cited some prior research and how that kind of changed my mind. And I'm not even, to answer your question, what is rapid fat loss? Well, the sexy answer is a pound a day. because that was shown in a very extreme population. Again, males with obesity. But that can at least be a conversation starter.
Yeah, and I think for most people, when they're thinking of rapid fat loss or whatever, it's largely in the context of I've got a gut and I want to get a six pack. And that is not going to be achieved in 4 days. I wish.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm hearing, and this is, well, I know this is what the evidence shows, but I mean, what I'm hearing from you though is outside of an aggressive approach, which is just one tool in your toolbox that has to be carefully considered, a rapid fat loss is maybe not quite as rapid as the word rapid sounds. It's just about the fastest sort of possible way to achieve that in a reasonable, period of time as it relates to your actual outcome goal, which might be to lose, say, 20 pounds. So what's the key metric behind that then? Because it's all very well doing it for 4 days, but for doing it for, say, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, 12 months, what's going to be the key behind that?
The key there will be adherence. So first thing I'll tell people is, tell me what you want to lose. And I want to lose 30 pounds of weight. And I'll say, okay, what you're really telling me is you want to lose 20 pounds of body fat, because we don't want to lose any lean mass if you're an athlete. So I'm always going to start the conversation. Again, I'm an over-communicator to help combat the natural impatience that everybody has. And I'm a fat loss researcher. That's essentially what I am. I don't think there's anybody who spends more time reading the literature on fat loss. I go on diets constantly. I have an obese family, so I'm predisposed to obesity. I love the science of this. If there's anybody who knows, or let me phrase it like this, there is nobody on this planet who understands more than I do that it is not a fast process. But you know who gets impatient when he goes on a diet and thinks that something's not working? Me. So if I'm susceptible to this, and I have all the knowledge, all the experience, I know and I sympathize with everybody else. They will get impatient and they will think it's not working. So I'll tell you right now, the best strategy that you could ever employ is what I call the 4-week rule. If you think things aren't working and you're about to try something else, and please don't try to eliminate your carbs if you're an athlete. Don't do that. Or try to, eliminate all carbs when you're an athlete. If you take your average body weight for the last 4 weeks and you continue to follow your diet that your coach put you on, and you take another average body weight in the next 4 weeks, I promise you, if you've been following the diet and you're healthy, you don't have a metabolic disease, you will see progress. The reason that people get impatient is the worst of this is I weighed 88 kgs yesterday, and today I'm 88.5. Well, that's the worst thing. That's yesterday to today. Tomorrow you might be 83. So there's the first problem. Do not base your emotion or your opinions based on a day-to-day. Take a week average. That gives you that cancels out the noise. But if you are patient enough to look at last month's average progress based on even body weight, and this month, when you've been following the diet, it will eliminate all of your fears that it's not working, because it works every time. Something else here. When I tell people you want to lose 20 pounds of fat or 10 kgs of fat, we're going to put this in the context of a 52-week plan. Now, that's just where we're going to start. It may not take that long, and maybe we'll be more aggressive. But I am over-communicating your natural inclination to be impatient and and I want you to fully understand this is a process. And this is crazy, and I'll encourage you or anybody else to do this. Look at any study ever published where the weight loss was 12, or where the weight loss research study was 12 months long. Any study, you find it, and there's more than a few. You're going to see almost an exact progress. And that progress is the subjects almost in every study lose weight and more weight and more weight until about 6 months. And then at that 6-month point, they start to gain all of their weight back. when they, in theory, according to the research, were still dieting. So why is that? Well, my belief, and so is I can cite more studies that have demonstrated this, more mathematical modeling studies, is that it's an adherence issue. So people can only diet for so long before they just run out of a desire to continue. Now, that they won't admit it. So the reason I bring this up is when I'm communicating with an athlete, we're going to do this for a year because that's going to enforce, one, that you're going to maintain your muscle mass. You're going to be able to improve your performance outcomes because we're doing this slowly. But we also are going to have in some built-in parameters for adherence. And what I don't want to do, if I have you diet every day for month after month after month, you are going to get tired of this. I call it diet fatigue. And you are just, essentially, you're going to quit. You might not admit you're quitting, but the research is clear. The weight starts coming back. So that's where, again, whether we bring in cardio as a new stimulus, maybe we increase calories and have a diet break. Maybe we adjust them. There's all kinds of things we can do to help prevent this natural plateau that we see almost across the board with 12-month weight loss studies. Yeah,
no, that's awesome. I think it's really clear to the listener. We can get bogged down into the, at sort of the very microscopic level, all the science and all the mechanisms and so on. But at the end of the day, it's a very humanistic thing, adherence. Now, I've got lots of podcasts and different things are being focused on, and we're not going to talk about things like protein and resistance training because that is obviously an important part of this. You have already mentioned that.
Yeah. Hey, could
talked about that a lot before. Yeah.
Let me give just one sentence that I think it's a great guiding point for any athlete who's going to go on a diet. And this is what I've learned from the research we've done in my own lab. And the numbers I'm going to give you are to essentially target fat loss and to maintain lean mass. And I'm going to assume that this also would maintain performance. A 25% caloric deficit. So if you know how many calories you're eating to maintain your current weight, and then you reduce that by 25%, and you continue to train and resistance train, and you, out of this 25% caloric deficit, you're eating at least 1.6 grams per kg of protein. And I would say 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg is a really good sweet spot. My research has reported in multiple studies that is a sweet spot of a caloric deficit where most people, males and females, lose fat, maintain muscle. And I would also suggest on the weekends or during days of competition, you go back to maintenance calories. This is not a perpetual caloric deficit. So weekends go back to maintenance. Days of competition or days of a hard training. So go ahead and just have a periodized caloric deficit plan.
Yeah. I mean, it's sound advice, and I wish we had more time. We've had a conversation about rapid fat loss. There's all sorts of, rabbit holes we could have did go down. And of course, there's other things we haven't yet spoken about, things like diet breaks and refeeds and so on in more detail. So maybe I can convince you to come back on another time and we can get into those sorts of topics. But there's only so much you can achieve in 1 hour. But I think what you have managed to go over in this past hour has been fascinating, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this as much as I have. So thank you, Professor Bill Campbell, for coming on to Fueling Greatness today.
Yes, thank you for having me. And thank you for what you've done for the profession. I have a lot of respect for you and how you've helped athletes in just embracing evidence-based. So thank you.
Well, thank you as well for saying that. I do appreciate it so much. And I know you're really busy, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.